it started.
Live streaming is on.
There it is. So, first, I'd like to just welcome our guest, Chris Fisher. Again, it's not an interview, but I think we'd be remiss not to hear from him and who he is and what his background is, because Chris, your experience with Stoicism is perhaps unmatched in the world of Stoicism, non-academic. We'd be remiss not to hear what you have to say also throughout the discussion. So could you just tell us, especially for Alvaro and Paul, and to anybody watching, what is your background in Stoicism? How did you come to it? And what are you doing today in the Stoic world?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Unmatched. I don't know about that. There's certainly some people in the community that I deal with who've been practicing this philosophy longer than I have. They may not be as visible as I am because they're not out there with blogs or podcasts, but they're certainly well versed, well practiced, and have been doing it for, like I said, a long time. My background, I guess my first exposure to small s Stoicism was in the United States Marine Corps. I was in the Marine Corps in late 1970s and got out in the middle of the 1980s. And I say small s because that's basically the suck it up buttercup version of Stoicism. And then I really wasn't acquainted at all with Stoicism as a philosophy until I guess my first exposure was in the middle of the 1990s. I picked up a copy of the Meditations, started reading it. Frankly, I was turned off by the God talk, and I put it aside. And it wasn't until I left my high technology career at about the turn of the century. I left and I came, made a transition shortly thereafter into law enforcement. I started in law enforcement in 2006 in midlife, maybe a midlife crisis. I have no idea, but I was worked for a very large organization, large law enforcement agency here in the state of Florida. And my role was on the streets of some pretty tough neighborhoods where drugs and prostitution and shootings and stabbings were a nightly occurrence. Coming from the world of high technology, where everyone wore suits and shirts and ties, it was an IBM world, to this was a shock to my system to some degree. Even though I had spent 6.5 years in the Marine Corps, I had not seen anything like this. That started me on a quest to try to understand what I was seeing, to try to have a better understanding of human nature. Read everything I could get my hands on, field of evolutionary psychology, human psychology, sociology, to try to understand why people were behaving the way they were. And at the same time, Nietzsche's famous saying is that when you fight monsters, you have to be careful not to become a monster. And that when you stare into the abyss also stares into you. And a couple of years into my law enforcement career, I started to realize this was taking a toll on me psychologically. And I don't mean in the sense that I was depressed or anything like that. I meant it was changing my view of humanity as a whole and giving me a rather sour view of humankind. And quite frankly, making me seek something else. I came across a book titled The Happiness Hypothesis, I believe, by Jonathan Haidt. And in there, he made a reference to Stoicism. Okay. Started looking at it a little bit more deeply. I picked up Lawrence Becker's book, A New Stoicism. I read it. I read, William Irvine's book. And then about that time, I wandered across this would have been 2011, I wandered across the College of Stoic Philosophers and saw that they offered an online course in Stoicism. I signed up, I took their basic course and was intrigued enough by what I had learned to engage their year-long program, which is what's known as the Marcus Aurelius program, far more of a one-on-one, in-depth study of the theory and practice of Stoicism, with Eric Weigart, the former scholar of the college, as my mentor. And then in 2013, I started mentoring at the college after I had graduated from the Marcus Aurelius program. And then in 2015, I started the Traditional Stoicism blog. And in 2018, I started the Stoicism on Fire podcast. The job, I made a transition from being on the street as a cop to being a traffic homicide investigator. And in 2019, that required me to step away for a while, and took a little longer break than I had intended from being a visible face on social media as far as Stoicism is concerned, but recently came back and restarted the podcast. And the board of directors at the college asked me to step in as the new academic head as Eric Weigart was retiring. So that's basically my background.
Thank you. And I first got connected with Chris because I started at the College of Stoic Philosophers taking their, not the Marcus Aurelius program. They have, especially for Alvaro and Paul and everyone else watching, there's a pre-program that you have to take before the Marcus Aurelius program. They give you basically an 8-week essential studies course in what is Stoicism. It does go more in depth than like our discussions here at Berlin Stoics, especially into the fundamentals. You read all the classics. You read a textbook on exactly what Stoicism is from the point of view of an analysis, so an academic's analysis of what the classics said. And that's how I got familiar with the College of Stoic Philosophers, the Traditional Stoicism blog, and Chris. And then that's what I thought would be useful for us to talk about today, was essentially what is traditional Stoicism? Because I think Chris's background would really fit nicely into this discussion, because today, most of what people hear is about modern Stoics, because modern Stoicism is the organization that funds, runs, and organizes the Stoicon, the annual Comic-Con but for Stoics. Every year, it's happening on October 9th this year. And I think for people who don't understand or have never read the classics, debating or not knowing what is and asking what is traditional versus modern Stoicism can be confusing, can be vague, can be like, okay, well, what is really the difference if you're all talking about the same ethical values? And if you had not already, I pulled up, because Chris's blog actually has some good food for thought and discussion in terms of a beginning of a discussion of what exactly is traditional versus modern Stoicism. And if I could just read just a short phrase from one of his articles, I think that can get us on the track to discuss further. Let's just have this open. He has a great article called "What is Traditional Stoicism?" And he states the following. Ironically, traditional Stoicism is something new. At least the word is. It is used most exclusively on social media to describe what was traditionally known simply as Stoicism. This new modifier became necessary with the recent advent of modern Stoicism. In a nutshell, traditional Stoics attempt to remain as close as possible to the path created by the founders, which includes 3 fields of study and practice: logic, physics, and ethics. Modern Stoics diverge from the Stoics' original path because they find the teleology of Stoic physics incompatible with their worldview. Traditional Stoics accept the divine and providential cosmos, while modern Stoics, who are typically atheists or agnostics, find the divine and providential cosmos of Stoicism unacceptable. Modern versions of Stoicism are certainly not wrong per se. In fact, in time, they may prove quite effective. Nevertheless, modern Stoicism represents a major divergence from Stoicism as scholars understand it. And so that's essentially, I think, a really good encapsulation of what traditional versus modern Stoicism is that there's a huge physical, I mean metaphysical gap between modern and traditional Stoics. And again, I think Chris made the point to say that it's not that modern Stoicism doesn't do its job in spreading Stoicism to people who might find it useful and effective in their lives, but that those who never study the metaphysics and logic that Stoicism has to offer may be missing something, especially that might help inform their ethics. And that's essentially the article in a nutshell, if you're interested. I do want to ask a general question to everybody, that I'll take this phrase: traditional Stoics accept the divine and providential cosmos. And this is thrown around a lot, that the original Stoics thought the universe to be rationally organized, providential, and divine. That is, that nature was imbued with God, or that God was nature. I'm not sure if there's a distinction, or if we have clarity on their specific distinction. But my first question is exactly that. What do the Stoics mean by divine? Because you hear divine thrown around in religion a lot, but divine seems to be a vague or ambiguous term about something to do with religion and something to do with God. And that's all that people really understand by the word divine. But maybe and this is open to everybody, but maybe Chris can start us off. What do the Stoics mean by divine exactly?
Yeah. And on my blog and in my podcast, I have a couple of pieces that deal specifically with the Stoic conception of God or divine. And unfortunately, we live in a secular age that is a response to a monotheistic age. And the response to the monotheistic age is one that has created a lot of, I'll call them psychological or emotional triggers. Triggers to words like God, providence, divine. So when most moderns read or see those words, and I was one of them, like I said, when I first picked up Marcus Aurelius and started reading the Meditations, all of that God talk just turned me off, because I had been a fundamentalist Christian at one point in time in my life. And I had also been, at the time I was reading the Meditations, I was a very hardcore avowed atheist. So I wanted nothing to do with that, because I projected my understanding of what those words meant onto Marcus's words and was very turned off by it. So the Stoic conception of God, the Stoic God is, first of all, a philosophical God. So what does that mean? It means it's not a God that's arrived at by revelation. No one went up on a mountain and was told about the Stoic God. The Stoic God is a God like the ancient Greeks, many of them assented to, which means they arrived at it through reason. They looked at everything in nature. They tried to explain how and why, how the universe exists, how human consciousness and reason exists, how it operates, and come to a place where you have to make what I call an existential choice, which is the same place that both someone like myself and a modern atheist would have to reach, which is the facts can only take us so far. Facts, science does not prove or disprove the existence of the divine. It cannot. And to argue that it does is just to be blunt and argue from ignorance, or it's an argument from a place of wanting to be a proponent of your worldview and try to convince others that you are correct by saying, well, science says, is really no more impactful or valid from a rational argument, in terms of rational argument, than saying, well, the Bible says, because science does not provide those answers. So you're required to take an existential step. Why are we here? How did this come into being? Did something truly come from nothing, as an atheist would have to argue, or maybe an infinite universe? So all of this brings us back to the philosophical God, which the Stoics, and I would argue, is a rational argument that explains these things without having to take a leap of faith and believe in, a holy scripture or an ancient book or something like that. The Stoic God is not a separate God. So you were correct in saying that in the Stoic mind, God and nature are the same thing. There is nothing outside of nature that exists that is God. God doesn't exist somewhere in the heavens, even though the ancient Stoics referred to God using the metaphor of Zeus. They were not referring to the mythological character of Zeus. They were just using a common term that the Greeks understood as the preeminent God to name their God. If you read the hymn of Cleanthes, he opens it by referring to him as the God of many names. Well, Logos, Pneuma, God, Father, nature, all of those were used by the Stoics to identify the same thing, which is a divine and providentially ordered cosmos, meaning that the cosmos has a purpose, it has reason, it is a living organism, and therefore it is not a Newtonian mechanism that, like a clock that operates purely deterministically and may eventually wind down. Now the Stoics would argue that it's going to burn up, but that's a different argument. So there's no, when the Stoics refer to prayer as an example, they're not praying in an intercessionary fashion to a external God to provide them with something. They are literally communicating with what Seneca and Epictetus, in particular, even Marx, refer to as the God within, the fragment of the divine within each of us, which is our human reason. So the Stoics would argue that, again, the entire cosmos is divine, and that it's imbued with reason, rationality, and that each of us is the recipient of a fragment of that reason or rationality, and that explains our human reason. And they would argue, as I think Pierre Hadot in his book, The Inner Citadel, clearly states that the Stoics, one of their fundamental principles is that there is no way that human reason could be derived from anything other than a higher source of reason. And so in a nutshell, that's a differentiator, because a lot of modern atheism is a response to monotheism. And so a lot of people who would claim to be atheists or agnostics, they've probably read people like Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, and I'm trying to remember Christopher Hitchens, the Four Horsemen of Atheism. You may have watched some of their YouTubes, and those are people who are speaking against monotheism. Unfortunately, because the language is the same, people react when I say the word providence. They think I'm referring to something out of Christianity. In fact, ironically, Christianity very rarely uses the word providence, because the word providence implies an order, and for the most part, most Christians wouldn't want providence, because providence would imply that intercession with God wouldn't make a difference. A Christian wants to believe that if I pray to God, I'm going to receive something special because I'm a good person. That would be in complete opposition to the Stoic conception of providence, which is that the world is orderly, the world has a purpose. In fact, one of my episodes on I'm trying to find it here. I can't find it quickly, but I interviewed a New Zealand philosopher who wrote a book, and he is I would call him probably I don't know if I call him an agnostic. I don't know where to put him. He's not religious in any sense, but he wrote a book on what he calls an anthropocentric proposivism. His argument actually comes from a Bentham type of ethics, but ultimately what he says is that modern ethics cannot survive in a universe that has no purpose. If the universe truly has no purpose, truly we live in a mechanistic, purposeless universe, then there really is nothing to ground our ethics on other than air, other than to say, well, I think this is right, and present some type of an argument. And if you disagree with me, who do I appeal to? Might makes right. What do we appeal to for? And so his argument is, as a philosopher, that without purpose in the universe, we don't have grounding for ethics. And the Stoics would very much agree with that. And and that's the primary. If you look at historically, that is the primary differentiator between the Stoics and the other Hellenistic philosophers, and in particular the Epicureans. The Epicureans, you'd be hard pressed to argue that they were atheists, maybe agnostics,
If I'm right, they were atomists, right? They followed from Democritus, so they believed that the world
They
was
were
nothing but a bunch
atomists.
of atoms, and so the world was purely
Yes,
deterministic and random.
they were atomists, which is why you see the argument, or not the argument, but the dilemma that Marcus poses several times: either providence or atoms. Well, to understand that dilemma, to understand what he's referring to, you have to have a basic understanding of what Stoicism means and what Epicureanism means. Because he's saying either the world is providentially ordered or it's atoms, it's chance. It just occurred by chance coincidence. And he juxtaposes those two worldviews. And clearly the scholars agree, and this is something where I disagree vehemently with some of the modern Stoic, and I won't even say the academics, because the academics don't go this far, but argue with some of the popularizers saying that, well, Marcus was saying that it really doesn't matter whether you believe in providence or atoms, that Stoicism applies equally well. That is simply not a supportable argument.
I'm surprised by that too, because I do still consider myself an atheist, but I'm actually quite surprised that people would interpret, like, I've never read Marcus Aurelius, and every other passage is an like he's alluding to God, providence, fate, or the cosmos, especially the cosmos, often enough. So I would be hard pressed to find a modern Stoic who could soundly defend the idea that Marcus wouldn't believe in providence.
Well, it's not defensible, and when I've challenged it, some of those people, I've asked for, well, how do you support that? Give me the Stoic text, or give me the scholar that says that Marcus is saying it really doesn't matter. And if you ask that question of them, they won't be able to provide it. I know, because I've asked on social media forums, please provide me with the recognized scholar of Stoicism that says. Now, here's what you will have. You do have some modern scholars who look at Marcus and question whether or not he was a Stoic. All right. So why would you read Marcus and question whether he's a Stoic? Well, there's only one way to question whether someone is a Stoic or not, and that is if they disagree with Stoicism, right? That's reasonable. So if I say, well, Marcus really wasn't a Stoic, I would have to offer you some reason why Marcus couldn't have been a Stoic, because he disagreed. Well, those are, John Rist was one of them. Those are people who question and say, well, Marcus really was questioning whether providence was true or not. So if you take the position that Marcus is questioning whether providence is actually true, then yeah, you are forced to question, was Marcus really a Stoic? Why? Because again, the scholars are in universal agreement. Providential cosmos was an essential and fundamental part of Stoicism as the ancients created it and recognized it. And no time in the history of the ancient Stoa was there a teacher of Stoicism that was a recognized teacher of Stoicism that denied that doctrine. Some moderns point to Aristo of Chios, who broke away from the ancient Stoa during the life of Zeno. He and interestingly enough, there's a good book I would recommend you guys get a hold of. It's very short, by Brad Inwood, a very short introduction to Stoicism, published in 2018. And Inwood, I think, does a really fair job. He references modern Stoicism, and he does a fair job of articulating how modern Stoicism, which tends to, if not deny, at least mitigate or overlook Stoic physics, because it doesn't agree with their metaphysical worldviews. He traces that back and says, well, that did exist in the ancient Stoa. Not in the Stoa, it existed in the person of Aristo of Chios, who left the Stoa, started his own school. His students were in ancient times referred to as Aristotelians, not Stoics. But he started a tradition. Inwood argues that tradition continued, but was overshadowed basically by the tradition of the Stoa as we know it, which is Zeno to Cleanthes to Chrysippus. But unfortunately, he makes the assertion that it continued to exist without any factual evidence of it having continued to exist beyond the lifetime of Aristotle. Do the thoughts continue to exist? Yeah, absolutely. Agnostics have been around for forever. Atheism, yeah, maybe not quite as prominent, but anyway, I hope that helps to explain a little bit and explain the differences. Now, then I'll let you go ahead.
Sorry. No, I had a follow-up question, and I think it's good that we maybe get into the specifics about what we mean by certain terms and what we mean by the theology of Stoicism, because I also want to make some part of this about modern Stoicism. So I want to, at some point, turn to the flip side and say, okay, what do the modern Stoics say, and how did they try and reconcile? Anyway, my other question was, because this is something that I've been toying around in my head with, and I haven't really found a good explanation of it in a book or online. But I think the misconception, and it sounds like from how you're speaking, there is a difference between providence and determinism, because when people think of providence out of a religious conception, people might boil that down to fate, and then people might boil that down to, well, science doesn't detract from that. It's just in the form of determinism, where there's a cause and effect for everything since the Big Bang, and so of course the future is predetermined. It's because there's this cause and effect change since the beginning of time, and that follows certain laws of physics, and so everything is determined in that sense. But from what I'm gathering, and from I know everything else I've read also indicates there is a difference between providence and pure determinism, and maybe you can help us out. I don't know if Alvaro, your mic is working also. You want to jump in at some point, because I know you're a Christian. If there are some differences you guys would maybe say is between providence and determinism, that might help me, but also everybody else.
Can you hear me well now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would like to maybe, I'm sorry if I sound like opposing a little bit what our guest had to say when he mentioned providence in Christianity. I do believe in Christianity there is still space for providence, especially when we see some prophecies from the Old Testament that are fulfilled in the New Testament. I'm not saying that we rely only on providence, but I think there are things in the Bible that is, you see different branches of Christianity supporting one more than the other. But the truth is that at the end, as a whole, you can see that there is a space for both perspectives. And I think there is still space for providence in Christianity. But I do certainly agree with the idea that providence is not a word that is found in the Bible. And because of that, it's maybe it's maybe going to the grassroots of Christianity, maybe not a Christian word. It's more of a word that has been used by people that have come up with Christian doctrine in order to explain certain things that appear in the Bible. With that said, I came to Stoicism in part because I was sort of disillusioned also with the many Christian talks that have come up, and I found in Stoicism rather an answer to maybe a better way to live my Christian life. So maybe in Christianity you see things like anger, like there is a tendency to believe, and maybe we can come up with scriptures that conclude that anger is a sin, but the Bible doesn't really tell you how to conduct yourself when you are angry. I'm sorry if I am diverting a little bit from the original question, but
it's quite okay.
The 2 points that I wanted to make is that I think there is a space for providence in the Bible, as there is a space for providence in Greek mythology. So we see the case of Oedipus, who was also prophesied that he will kill his mother and marry his father, and he ended up doing that. And that's one thing. And when it comes to determinism, I also believe that there is a space for that. And yeah, I don't know if this answers your question. Maybe you caught me a little bit off guard, and I'm just speaking my mind, and this sounds really disorganized. And by no means I apologize also to the guest if this sounds like if I was contradicting what he was saying, but I was just speaking my mind, and I'm sorry if I'm digressing.
No, of course, this is the space to
No,
do
not
it.
at all.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's a good perspective to have also because you do come from a Christian background, and currently label yourself a Christian. It's good to hear what you have to say, especially if you do think that in some respect, Providence does have a space in it. But then I still, and I think, let's take your example of Oedipus, for example, and the famous story of Oedipus falling in love with his mother, and I still can't see the distinguishing factor between providence and determinism. Determinism being that there's a defined future already predetermined, and it will happen no matter what because of this cause and effect nature in the universe. Cause and effect doesn't have to be physical, but cause and effect in any respect. I think, and I don't know if Chris, you have some clarity on this, but my initial understanding is that providence and determinism, the main distinguishing factor is who's doing the causing. So determinism is, is a description of how the universe is ordered by purely physical constituents, atoms, or anything below that, and they ascribe by physical laws that happen to cause things to happen in a very defined and predetermined way. Whereas in providence, the cause of things is not, well, is physical because, of course, for the Stoics, nature is God. But in a sense, nature has a rational capability. And so when nature causes things to happen, it's done so for the purpose of some end in the world or for some end in the universe. And that's the purpose of why nature is causing things to happen. So the difference is, from my understanding, is that who's doing the causing and what that causing is for. In determinism, it's for because it happened to be that way. It was coincidental that it was predetermined that way. And in providence, it was determined that way by nature because, well, nature wanted some end to that. Correct me if I'm wrong, maybe because I'm wrapping my head around this.
Yeah, and I would say if you can fully get your head around it and explain it, you probably deserve a couple of honorary PhDs. But it's not an easy topic. But let's see if I can shed some light on it. So if we go to the extremes, on one extreme, which is the necessary, but it's the necessary entailment of materialism that a lot of atheists would either try to deny, look away from, explain away, whatever the case might be. But it's hard determinism. If we truly live in a mechanistic universe where everything is dependent upon chemical reactions and physical interactions between entities, then everything is determined. We are determined. That's called hard determinism. In other words, you do not have free will, which is what people like Daniel Dennett and others argue. We don't have free will. We just have this illusion of free will. And so a lot of atheists spend a lot of time trying to talk their way out of this corner because materialism puts you in the corner of, yeah, you don't have any free will. You're an automaton. You are what Richard Dawkins says, you're a large lumbering robot with one purpose in life, and that is to pass your selfish genes on to the next generation. So that's one extreme. Now let's look at the other extreme of determinism, which is God controls everything. God's sitting up there in the clouds and he's moving the chess pieces around on the board, and we're just pawns in this. Not a lot of difference between those two, but both are extremes of the deterministic argument. In between those, you have what's known as soft determinism, which means that, yes, we do have physical laws that determine things. So when I go to a fatal traffic crash and I see that a car doing 50 miles an hour hit the side of another car at 50 miles an hour, I can using the weight of that car and the speed of that car, that can determine the amount of kinetic energy applied into the side of that car. Now I can determine how much kinetic energy was absorbed by the human body in that car. And I can say, yes, that's an amount of kinetic energy or change in velocity, which will cause death, because the organs in a human body can't survive with that much change in velocity in a short period of time. Those are physical laws. Now, some religious people might argue, well, if I prayed hard enough, or if God granted a miracle, in that particular instance, that particular human might be able to survive that crash. And I see some pretty weird things in traffic crashes, but nothing that's outside of the realms of reasonableness. In other words, I've yet to be on a traffic crash where I say, well, this is truly a miracle. I mean, say, yeah, this is a freak set of circumstances that happened this way, but nothing that we would say, yeah, the person was suddenly lifted out of the driver's seat of the car and was standing on the side of the intersection when the crash occurred because God intervened. So what does soft determinism mean? That means that we are co-participants with the providential order of the cosmos. Remember, I said that we each possess a fragment of the reason which permeates the cosmos. Well, if we each possess a fragment of that reason, then the same reason that is providentially ordering the cosmos, we have a piece of it within us, and we are co-contributors to our own fate. We do have some form of free will. I'm a 5'9", 160-pound guy. It is not within my capabilities to play in the NBA. All right, it's just not. That's a genetic predisposition. I'm not going to be able to overcome that. I'm not going to be able to fly, unless I have some external apparatus that allows me to fly. But as a human being, if I go to the top of a building and I jump off, the laws of the world are going to, the laws of the universe are going to make I hit the ground and I'm going to die from that fall if it occurs from a certain height. So, but I do interact with the world in the sense that and in Stoicism, I have the opportunity to, and this is the key difference in Stoicism, I have control of my proviresis, of my rational abilities. I get to choose my thoughts. I get to choose my judgments of those thoughts, I should say. So I get to choose whether losing my leg in a traffic crash is a bad thing and that I should be morally distraught by it and destroyed by it, or it's really an indifferent, meaning not indifferent as that I don't care about it, but that it does not affect my human, my ability to reason. It does not affect my moral character, and therefore does not affect the good flow that I have the potential of having in my life, even though it's something that we would interpret as bad. The Stoics would call it a dispreferred indifferent. Well, if I live my life in such a way that views the world like that, how can we possibly argue that I'm not a different person? And if I'm a different person and I'm responding to the world in a different way, then I have, in a sense, changed my fate. If I haven't changed my fate, if I haven't and somehow interacted with Providence, how could the Stoics even make an argument that, as Chrysippus did, you can change that cylinder? If you've heard his metaphor of a cylinder, our character is a cylinder rolling down the hill, and when you change the shape of the cylinder, you change the way that the cylinder rolls. Well, he's arguing that we have the power to change that cylinder. Ironically, through modern scientific discoveries, one of them being neuroplasticity, which can't be explained in materialist terms, now proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that we have the ability to change our physical brains through our thoughts, to reshape them, to remold them in ways, to recreate neural pathways that didn't exist before based upon the way that we think. So we are co-contributors to our own fate, which is the difference between hard determinism and soft determinism. So when you read that the Stoics were determinists, yes, they were, but they did believe in free will, depending on how you view that term. And they did allow for our action as rational agents within a cosmos. We were not mechanistically determined to behave the way that we do. So does that in any way help?
Thank you. No, yeah. And I think that's a good lead-in to the next part. By the way, welcome, Jacob. I wrote you in the chat just so I don't interrupt Chris talking. Welcome back. It's good to have somebody else on here also because we had 12 of us signed up, and it's good to see one of the other 12 come by. Alvaro, I'll go to you, and then I want to transfer into the next portion of the discussion to modern Stoicism. But if you wanted to respond to something Chris said, by all means, go ahead.
Yes, I think this also goes well with the idea of discussing modern Stoicism. And I just wanted to mention that my perception is that modern Stoicism is maybe not embracing the idea of providence and sticking so much with the idea of determinism, because it seems to me that many of the leading figures in modern Stoicism are picking up on Stoicism more from a psychological perspective. So while I was mentioning that I want to know how to conduct myself when I'm angry, coming more from a Christian perspective, they are thinking more of how to manage anger more from a mental health well-being. And certainly when you factor in the mystical world, things can get very much more complicated when it comes to psychology. And in that sense, I think it's convenient, if not easier, just to push aside the idea of determinism, which might open the doors for the mystical also. So yeah.
Oh, thanks for mentioning that. It also helps to understand why, for your case, Alvaro, why people come into Stoicism, whether it's from the physics of the ancient Stoics, the ethics of the ancient Stoics, and in your case, it was the ethics. It was or as we might call it, psychology, because for them there was little distinction between the two. But it also helps to understand why it would help you to be informed by the physics of the ancient Stoics, or at least be given another option besides hard determinism. I think maybe a synonym for soft determinism would be compatibilism. I actually wanted to, this is a really good transition point as we're discussing this idea of compatibility, this idea of hard determinism, and also the psychological premise of Stoicism, which I guess could be considered twofold. One is that you have things within and without your power to act on, or you're unable to act on, and the other being that you have the capability to assent or withhold assent to things that you judge for the outside world. And I just want to paraphrase, read off a section just like I did in the beginning of another article on Chris's blog. This one is titled "The Connection Between Physics and Ethics," of course, in regards to the Stoic physics and ethics. And specifically a section called "The Modern Debate." He summarizes the modern academic debate going on between academics who, beginning with one in particular who argues that while physics is connected to ethics in the Stoic framework, it's not necessary in order to conclude the Stoic ethics, that one can independently follow Stoic ethics without following the Stoic or believing in the Stoic physical framework. And I'll just repeat the phrase that Chris put on this article by this academic, Julia Anas, in 1993. And the quote goes, "Nature in Stoic theory is not a non-ethical foundation for ethics. A physical and theological notion from which ethics is derived. Nature as that is relevant to ethics. The determination of our final end is human nature. Human nature is part of cosmic nature, but in doing ethics, as opposed to studying the role of ethics in physics and theology, cosmic nature does not determine ethical theses, and even human nature is not an independent foundation for virtue. Virtue and nature are interdependent elements in an overall theory." which I think encapsulates the kind of maybe the beginning of modern Stoic arguments, at least in the academic framework. So I do understand that there's a lot of popularizers who are not philosophical academics, who don't study philosophy academically, who don't contribute to that body of academic work. But she does, and I think she maybe may mark the beginning of, it sounds like, the modern Stoic interpretation of the original framework, that while virtue and nature, or ethics and physics in Stoicism, are interdependent, the physics of Stoicism does not determine the ethical foundations of Stoicism. A broad question, and Chris doesn't necessarily have to answer, but he can if he wants, because I think this question is more open-ended. What do you guys think in general? If you were following Stoic ethics and the Stoic ethical principles, do you believe that you require a divine or providential cosmos in order to inform your ethical point of view and your ethical practice, or don't you? Do you think that you feel quite comfortable practicing Stoic ethics without regard to the providential and divine and rational organism that is nature for the Stoics? Let me just switch my screen to see anybody's hands up. Oh yeah, Jacob, go ahead.
In order to be ethical, right, the reason can't be ethical, right? Reason is limited, right? The ethical, the moral, is unlimited, has no limits. So reason can never be ethical. Whatever reason thinks is ethical is not ethical. It's a limitation and distortion and imitation of the truth, right?
There's what you're saying is that
is there another capacity, right, that we can activate so that we will be the very embodiment of ethics and morality in day-to-day living, in our daily life? Because we know reason is limited. Reason can't get to the ethical, right?
Okay. So you would agree that some physical or theological, sorry, when I say physical, I mean in the ancient word. So theological or divine cosmos would be, or divine framework would be required for an ethical framework, because reason alone or logic alone can't necessarily bring you to ethical principles.
When you use the word divine, it's as if something's outside, right? So I'm saying you're already there. It's inside. You're complete. You have it within you already. It's just not activated because thought, as the thinker, has taken over, right? Thinker must come to an end. When there's no thinker, the other is. It's already there. It's activated in you. I mean, it's already in potential. It's there in you. So it doesn't require a divine or something outside you.
Okay. I misunderstood. Okay.
It's a capability of the human being. It is there already.
Oh, it's a behavior
capability.
So it can be
it's an
not
intelligence,
assumed, but
an intelligence. There's the intelligence of thought, thinking, right? There's that intelligence, and then there's this other intelligence, right? Which takes place when there's no me, when there's no thinker, no observer, no perceiver, no experiencer. Then this other intelligence is operating, and that intelligence can use thought for function.
Okay.
We were born this way. We were born complete, ready to go. But thought made an image, right? We've been doing this for thousands of years now, and that image is blocking this other intelligence. It's preventing the other. Where one is, the other is not. Where there's a me, this other intelligence is not.
I'm not sure what you mean by these two different intelligences.
The me is an illusion put together by thought. Thought invented it because the organism was seeking security and permanency, right? So there is no me, actually. It's just a mirage. There's nothing there. But we are living under a delusion, right? We are a slave. We're living in the matrix. The matrix is the tricks of the thinker, right? the tricks, material. So we're being tricked all the time. We're living in a virtual reality bubble. You never see me. You never see the bird, the cloud, the tree. You only see your version of it. So when that comes to an end, right? That illusionary machine-like structure, when it comes to an end, then the other is. This other intelligence I'm talking about.
Okay.
And then that intelligence can use knowledge for function. Knowledge being know-how, passive memory, how to use language, how to use the computer, etc.
Could I just switch to Alvaro has his hand up also? Alvaro, would you like to respond or to what something Jacob said, or just answer the general question?
Yeah, I'll sort of do both. I think that as a Christian, of course, I'm biased, but it does help me tremendously to see references to prayer, to see references to God. And it brings the idea of becoming a wise man, of becoming virtuous, much more meaningful to me. It is also quite joyful to me to see these terms in Stoic writing, because it is very similar to writings you see in wisdom books in the readings, in wisdom writings in the Bible, I'm sorry, such as Proverbs. So being biased and coming from a Christian perspective, it helps me tremendously to the extent that oftentimes that I feel that I just want to add some writings of Seneca and some Stoic writings to my Bible. It feels like part of the Bible, and I hope Christians, since this recording, don't take offense by that. With that said, I don't think it is needed. I think Jacob is mentioning a lot of things that are reminiscent to me of Buddhism. And if there is one religion or belief that I feel has been the most mixed with Stoicism nowadays, is Buddhism. And I think in Buddhism, at least Theravada Buddhism, which is the less secular one, according to what I have been told, they don't really dive into the idea of God a lot.
Okay, thank you, Alvaro.
Just to correct you, I'm not talking about Buddhism. What I'm saying is the direct opposite of Buddhism. Buddhism, right, has rituals, beliefs, scriptures, right, techniques. I'm saying all of that activity is feeding the illusion of the me, right? All the monks and their monk work is just building up the me, the illusion that there is a me. So, yeah, I'm not talking about Buddhism.
Okay.
I'm talking about the end of Buddhism, the end of all isms, right? Which make up the me. All your beliefs, your stories, your concepts, all of that, your identity makes up your identity. This thing, right now, it's acting. Right now, it's listening. It's acting as a listener, the interpreter. This active memory. You can watch it with it. It's happening. It's saying, I agree with this. I don't agree with that. This makes sense. This doesn't. I wish I was on the beach right now. That activity is active memory. It's your programming, right? Which formulates the perceiver, the observer.
Yeah. Sorry, we're jumping through a few different theoretical loops here. But thank you guys for responding. Actually maybe Alvaro wanted to expand on what he was saying, because I know he mentioned Buddhism, but I wasn't quite sure about his position about practicing Stoicism. But of course, I think from what it sounds like, because you were saying that you may be biased, of course your Stoicism is supposed to help inform you already of your theological position. So you want to continue practicing your theological position, and your Stoic ethics is there to help aid that, which I think is quite interesting. It's a little bit like the reverse of what Stoic ethics in ancient framework was, such that they used Stoic physics. They used not Stoic physics, but physics, and their metaphysical point of view in order to justify their ethics. And for you, it's a little bit like the reverse. You're coming it from the other end of this other end, where you already have your physics grounded, not necessarily Stoic physics. And your Stoic ethics is simply helping you to fill in the gaps that Christianity wasn't there to fill. That's quite interesting, but also quite interesting to hear from the perspective of somebody who, regardless of where you're coming from, still thinks that one can help the other from whichever side you're coming from. For me, I was Christian very early on, so I was Catholic brought up, and then Catholic until maybe 11th, 12th grade of high school. And then I was an altar boy throughout my years. I mean, I was a very, very devout Catholic, but by 10th or 11th grade, fell out of favor with Christianity. And I befriended somebody who became a good friend of mine, who was an agnostic. And I eventually independently became an atheist, and all the way up until today. And I still can't, for me, although I don't think that, I think also Chris painted this in a very, or phrased this in a very good way, that science doesn't necessarily prove God exists, but that doesn't mean that science is disproving God exists. In other words, science doesn't, scientific fact shouldn't preclude somebody from having a belief in the divine, or a belief in an external or naturalistic God. And for me as well, I don't necessarily think that I have no problems, and I don't think Stoic ethics preclude somebody, especially because the Stoic ancients did that themselves, somebody believing in a naturalistic God, or a God in general, who, created and rationalize it as a providential universe. But for me, I have always found myself able to really, really stay on board with Stoic ethics without regard to Stoic physics. I've been trying to hit maybe a few different principles of Stoic ethics that might require, because I really try and argue to myself whether or not, like Stoic cosmopolitanism, for example, the idea that we are all brethren under one universe, the Greek word for the city of the universe. So perhaps hierarchy circles can't be justified without a Stoic physics. But for me, I feel quite at home being with Stoic ethics and logic, and without regard to at least the Stoic physical assumption that there is a naturalistic God, or that God is nature and divine and rationalized and is rational. Yeah, I think, maybe I'll pass this off to Chris, because maybe, Chris, you had mentioned in one of your articles that, of course, there's that doctrine of this tradition of Stoics that is not really a doctrine any different from Stoicism itself. It's just going back to the ancient Stoics. But you mentioned, and I don't remember which article, you also mentioned that there's kind of the reason that somebody might need Stoic physics to help inform the Stoic ethics is not necessarily because of a belief in a Stoic God, although that's the whole idea, that's the whole point, is to help that ground your Stoic ethics. But a belief in a naturalistic God or nature as providential and rational strengthens and actually helps you stay more committed to Stoic ethics, become a virtuous person, become an altruistic person, or just, wise. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I mean, how do you think that, or do you think that Stoic ethics can be practiced without Stoic physics? And if not, how do you think Stoic physics informs that ethics?
Yeah, I think I would say it's the wrong question, or it's a wrongly articulated question. So let me try to explain that. I want to go back first. I want to address something, because you quoted from one of my papers, and you quoted Julia Annis, who in 1993, as I was pointing out in that article, was probably the first recognized scholar to question whether Stoic physics was essential for the practice of Stoic ethics. All right. Now, but you have to carve out what she was asking, and then watch her evolution of thought, because when she published her book in 1993, which I'm trying to remember what the name of that book was. That was her, it's her famous book on ethics, but she was immediately challenged by Stoic scholars like John Cooper, who immediately fired back and said, no, you cannot throw that out. Well, what's interesting is now, same author, Julia Annis, 4 years later, after this debate with some Stoic scholars, says, and I'm quoting again, the person who has studied ethics then needs to go on not only to study the other two, but to integrate their results with ethics to produce a unified understanding from all three perspectives. So Annis herself came back around and said, and the argument really is not, is Stoicism, can you remove Stoicism? The argument amongst the scholars is not, can you take Providence out, but what role Stoic physics plays in the holistic system of Stoicism, meaning, is it foundational? Does ethics rely, is it built on their physics, or is it interconnected? And I don't know that it really makes a difference. Christopher Gill, who is, part of the modern Stoic intelligentsia academic group, he argues that it's interconnected. And I think there's no reason to demand that it be foundational. But if it's interconnected, it can't be disconnected. And you think of what are the three Stoic similes for describing their system? They use an egg, they use an orchard, and they used an animal. Well, what's interesting about those? None of them are artifacts. None of them are items that we build. They didn't say, well, it's like a cart, or it's like a building with a roof and a foundation. No, they said an egg, an animal, and an orchard. All three are organic. And all three, if you remove any part, now for the egg, they said that the soul, the physics, was the yolk. For the animal, it was the soul. And for the orchard, it was the soil. Well, you can't remove the soil from an orchard and bear fruit. You can't take the rational principle, what exists as a rational principle, out of an animal, their soul, and have them exist as an animal. And you certainly can't take the yolk out of an egg and have it exist as an egg. So the argument was, you cannot separate these. Now, the question that's proposed is, can we practice Stoic ethics without assenting to a providential cosmos? The answer is, unequivocally, without any reason to argue, yes. But I would argue that's not the right question. The right question is, when we remove providence and we practice these Stoic ethical principles, are we practicing Stoicism? It's a completely different question. All right. So, Brad Inwood would say in his book, yes, but he labels it minimal Stoicism. That's the label he puts on it. You are practicing minimal Stoicism, which is the Stoicism that just focuses on the ethics and kind of ignores the others. The Stoicism that is recognized through tradition, through the heritage of Western culture, and through the scholars, is large Stoicism. It's the Stoicism that came to us through Cleanthes, Zeno to Cleanthes to Chrysippus, and it's the one that Epictetus and Musonius Rufus and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca express in their writings. There's no doubt, there's not a one of them that did not rely on the concept of a providential cosmos. That's clear in their writings for their ethical practice. Now, can you strip the ethical pieces away from Stoicism and still, the providential, the theology, the physics away from, and still practice Stoic ethics? Yeah. My question in return would be, how is that Stoic? Because what you've in essence said is, I'm practicing virtue ethics. Virtue ethics was not unique even in the time of the Stoa. It was just virtue ethics. And while you may be able to pull some mind hacks or something else out of quotes from Stoicism that help support virtue ethics from a Stoic point of view, but virtue ethics is virtue ethics. It's not Stoic ethics. And up until the advent of modern Stoicism, no one conceived of modern Stoicism as anything other than a tripartite holistic philosophy. Now, I say all of that, and I might leave everybody with the wrong impression, and that is that somehow I'm opposed to modern Stoicism and that I think it's a bad thing or something of that nature. I have said the opposite repeatedly on my podcast, and still people think that of me. I do not think modern Stoicism is a bad thing. In fact, I think it is a wonderful thing. If modern Stoics, which they do, are able to perpetuate virtue ethics and any semblance of Stoicism in a widespread manner throughout the world's a better place for it. And if you really want to question, let's talk about how Providence is not something that's commonly accepted in our modern world. It's virtue ethics. Walk out on the street on any given city at any given time, walk up to somebody and say, hey, what do you think about virtue ethics? There aren't too many people who assent to the idea that we should live virtuous lives. That's an extreme minority position in modern culture. Now, you could I think rationally argue that piling the providential cosmos on top of that makes it more of a minority position. Okay, so be it. But you've already taken a position that is not popular, that is not supported by science, that is outside of the very idea that somehow living a virtuous life gives you well-being or happiness. I would argue, at least from the ancient conception, the Stoic conception of virtuous life, is completely contrary to modern thought. Find me a modern atheist outside of the modern Stoic movement who really ascribes to a concept of virtue ethics that's anything like Stoicism and says this is the way we should live. They would be a rare bird, especially in academia. So I think modern Stoicism is a wonderful thing in the sense that it's introducing the world abroad to Stoicism and to concepts of ethical behavior that they would otherwise not hear. They're not going to hear it. My Traditional Stoicism blog has a fairly small reach. My podcast, I'm approaching 400,000 downloads. Big deal. I suspect Joe Rogan gets that with one episode. My point is that we're not going to reach the world in large in a secular age with traditional Stoicism. Modern Stoicism has a much broader appeal, is going to entice a lot more people to pay attention to the Stoics, and in the process, a few people who are introduced to modern Stoicism, like me. I told you I first read Becker, then I read Irvine, and then I went into the College of Stoic Philosophers. And I was an atheist at the time I entered the College of Stoic Philosophers. I was a hardcore atheist. I was a hardcore atheist until the second term of the Marcus Aurelius program, when I finally came face to face with the idea that I can't practice Stoicism the way it's articulated in these Stoic writings and still hold on to my idea that the world is just an accidental occurrence and that atheism is true. So, and I remember making the existential choice in the Marcus Aurelius program, because it's not forced on you in the part of that program. I knew I was either going to walk away from Stoicism or I was going to have to find a way to get my head around the Stoic conception of the divine and providential cosmos, which is what I endeavored to do. So I'm not opposed to modern Stoicism. And I think the animosity that exists between the two camps, quite frankly, is unfortunate. I think, to be fair, a lot of the animosity is not generated by traditional Stoics toward modern Stoics. It's quite the opposite, which is why historically in 2015, I created the Traditional Stoicism Facebook group, because when we were in the Modern Stoicism Facebook group and we tried to talk about these topics, we were shouted down. We were called religious nuts. We were, all this just ad hominem attacks. And we finally said, hey, we're going to have our own Facebook group to even have rational discussion about these topics. So I hope that helps to differentiate modern Stoicism from traditional Stoicism. And I would challenge you again to ask yourself, in what way, if I remove these other aspects of Stoicism from my theory and practice, in what way am I practicing Stoicism?
Yeah. No. Yeah, that does
Greg,
help. Sorry. Yeah.
granted,
Thank
you
you.
are practicing it. Go ahead.
No, sorry. No, but thank you for clarifying. And it is a wrong question that I definitely asked, because of course, like you said, somebody could definitely ascribe to the same virtue ethics that the Stoics did, but of course, then you're not talking about Stoicism. You're talking about Xism, X for whatever you want to call your specific ethical brand, and which is all fine and good, but and maybe by the time I finish my studies at the College of Stoic Philosophers, I'll have also changed. But I think it is just quite interesting to peer into this to this debate and at least ask myself, what do I really want out of a virtue ethic practice? Is it Stoicism? Is it simply the virtue ethics I get from Stoicism? We had another atheist who reads Hitchens, who reads a lot of the atheist popularizers, and actually he doesn't come anymore. He unfortunately dropped out of our Telegram group. But at one meeting, we were talking about Stoic physics. And he said, well, you know what, if I can get on board with any religion, it would be the one that the Stoics thought of. Because for me, believing in a very naturalistic theology, a God that was imbued in nature, so nature as God itself, is a lot more rational than believing in some divine being external to our physical reality that for some reason somehow, you know, changes the orders of the chips and the cards of our lives every day, you know. So for him, actually, and that was good to listen to, because even if I stay atheist, I really feel more at home in Stoic physics and to its naturalistic theology than any theology today that makes God some external being to our universe, that for me seems foreign and stale. And the Stoic physics feels right at home with its ethics. Alvaro.
Yes, I have two follow-ups. Maybe the first one is sort of a redundant question, but I would like to know if the College of the Stoics Philosophers has a traditional Stoic approach to Stoicism.
What maybe just to take one question apart by itself is that, and actually I should have maybe let Chris speak, but just from my knowledge is that it's neither traditional or modern in the sense of telling you what brand of Stoicism or what, you know, that is modern versus traditional to ascribe to. All it's telling you is that this is what Stoicism is, and study the classics, study all of its components, its physics, its logic, and ethics, and then help inform you how to practice Stoicism. At least that's from my understanding and from my experience. Chris, I don't know if you have a different answer.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't ask questions about your beliefs when you apply to the school. We don't at any point, and this includes the Marcus Aurelius program, we don't at any point say, well, you know, you have to believe in a Stoic providential cosmos in order to continue on with your education. That's not a prerequisite. It's not a litmus test. We use John Seller's book, Stoicism. This is the text. He's an academic. He's a part of the modern Stoic cadre. We point to the Stoic texts. We don't see, and this is where I think there's some misunderstanding, that somehow traditional Stoicism is something different than Stoicism, that we've added something on. So what you'll find is that when you come to the college and you study Stoicism, you're going to realize that you're studying traditional Stoicism. The only reason we even have, as Steve read from my original post, the reason we have to have the term traditional Stoicism today is because of the advent of modern Stoicism in, what was it, 2000 and I think around 12 or 13, when it first, maybe even 14, when that term first started circulating on the internet. But the term traditional Stoicism is a response to it. There is no difference between Stoicism, as you will read, pick up Sellers, pick up A. Long is my favorite scholar. Pick up any recognized scholar of Stoicism and read what they have to, how they define Stoicism and what they say about Stoicism. And that's traditional Stoicism. And it's just that we traditional Stoics attempt to say that's still viable. That's still viable theoretically. It's still viable as a practice. Now, when we say we assent to Stoic physics, we don't say, oh yeah, there's still 4 elements. So there are things that they got wrong because they had a basic they didn't have what we have in terms of modern science, but none of that changes the concepts. None of it changes the providential cosmos. None of it changes the idea that we have to have logic in order to train our rational minds. None of that changes the basic foundational principles of Stoicism. So that's a long answer to no. We don't try to steer you in the college. We just present you with the texts.
Yeah, thank you. And Alvaro, you had a follow-up question, another one, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what I meant by traditional Stoicism. I had come across your blog, and I had come across the College of Stoic Philosophers, and I joined your Facebook page, by the way. The idea that I had, the understanding that I got about traditional Stoicism was that more like the original Stoicism, or if you will, the oldest form of Stoicism. With that said, I think that also happens since Christianity, and as a Christian, I think that's part of the disillusionment that many people, myself included, have with Christianity, that you see a lot of people are in doctrine, and when you start studying those doctrines, a lot of it is helpful, but you can start seeing how things change the original writings, the original meaning of the scriptures. And it is a very complex stuff to do. So part of this is actually an effort to understand the scriptures. So it is at the same time valid. I don't know, maybe it is, as I often refer to institutional religion, maybe this is also a necessary evil. But that's also my fear with Stoicism, that I may end up also disillusioned with Stoicism by approaching it from a more academic perspective. Maybe start reading books that are very academic, that use terminologies to explain what Marcus Aurelius himself, what Epictetus himself had, what they had to say, and makes me wonder. I just want to ask you, Chris, in your opinion, maybe I'm not ready for it now, but for somebody who wants to become a Stoic, to what extent you can be a Stoic without being as informed as somebody who goes through the College of Stoics Philosophers and who basically just picks up this Stoic writings, just like somebody picking up the Bible and having an true encounter with those writings and becoming a true believer, if you will, for lack of a better word, if you will allow that analogy.
Well, I think in particular the writings of Epictetus and Seneca, even, and Marcus Aurelius do provide a gateway that if you sat down and said, okay, the only thing I'm going to do is study these writings as translated into a language that I understand, because obviously, there's some academic work that gets it to you. I don't read Greek. I don't read Latin. So some academic had to translate that stuff for me. And a part of that translation is trying to understand what those words meant to them at that time in their culture. But just diving into those texts and just studying those texts will give you a very good, solid, deep understanding of what Stoicism was to them, and the theory and the practice. Enough of the essentials that, whether you call yourself a Stoic, I don't go around calling myself a Stoic. There's no one that I work with that would say, oh yeah, Chris is a Stoic. Why? Because I don't use that word to describe myself. Now I call myself a practicing Stoic on my podcast, but it's not a label that I wear on my shirt sleeve when I go out in public. It's not an identity for me. It just happens to be a philosophical way of life that I follow. Now, where the excuse me, where the academics help, and with the preface of that is, yeah, academic philosophy as a whole is an abomination in modern times. I hate to say it, but the academics who help us to understand the Stoic texts, guys like John Sellers, A.A. Long, John Cooper, David Sedley, those guys provide wonderful insights into the text, because every once in a while you're going to come across something and you're going to say, what in the world did the Stoics mean by that? What does Marcus mean by, as an example, when you read Providence or Atoms, if you didn't understand what those terms meant to Marcus, you wouldn't understand what he's questioning there, what he's juxtaposing in between those two worldviews. So you can go a long way. You don't have to go to the College of Stoic Philosophers to be a Stoic. That's absurd. I wouldn't say that there's any one person or any one book. In fact, my argument is think for yourself. Get into the Stoic texts and think for yourself. Don't. In fact, one of the reasons why, if you go on my blog, you will see that every blog post, every podcast transcript I put up there, I provide references. I don't want you to believe me. I'm not an academic. I'm not an expert. I want you to take what I say and go, I wonder if that's true. Let me go look for myself. Get into the text. Pick up the academic book that I referenced. Go look for yourself and think for yourself. Don't allow anyone, me or any of the modern Stoics that hold themselves up as the modern Pauls of the Stoic movement, to tell you what to think about Stoicism. Figure it out for yourself, because it's pretty plain. It's really not as complex as a lot of people think. Unfortunately, Lawrence Becker turned it into something.
You should
that
extend
made
it to the self. Don't listen to the self
complex.
either.
Sorry, Jacob, you're
I would extend it to the self, the inner tyrant. You're saying reject the outer tyrant, and also reject the inner tyrant.
Jacob, wait, are you speaking to us, or are you speaking to someone else?
Yes,
because your mic is still on.
speaking to you. I'm saying.
Oh, sorry. No, you didn't know, because
to
Chris
extend
is
it to the self.
Okay.
Don't listen to yourself either.
Okay. Sorry, Chris. No, I just wanted to know because your video is turned off. I didn't know if, Jacob, you were speaking to somebody off the camera or somebody on here. No.
I did want to offer one other thing, if I can, Steve, and that is, the earlier question was, can you practice Stoic ethics without Stoic physics? Well, let me rephrase that in another way and give you something else to think about. Can you practice the golden rule without being a Christian? Can you practice the Beatitudes without being a Christian? Can you practice Christian ethics, upon which most of our Western culture is based, without being a Christian?
The Christians don't do it.
Jacob, I'm sorry. I really have to hear Chris speak. And we're also way over time. So if Chris could just finish speaking, and then I can wrap things up. Sorry, Chris.
So the idea that we can unravel ethical principles, and you could do that with any philosophy. You could unravel the ethical principles, the ethical behaviors from the system as a whole and practice them. But I doubt that anyone who says, well, yeah, I believe in the golden rule. There's a lot of people that probably believe and live by the golden rule who would not identify as Christians. Where that would go wrong is someone coming out and say, well, I believe in the golden rule. I live the golden rule. I'm a Christian. Well, do you believe that Christ died on the cross for your sins? Well, no. Do you believe that Christ was God? Well, no. Well, then how are you a Christian? And see, Christians would say, you're not a Christian. You just pulled some ethical principles out of the Bible and you're living according to those ethical principles, but you're not a Christian. There's a difference. There's a difference.
The belief is separate from the actual living it.
Correct. And living it does not necessarily identify with the system is the point. To identify, people want to, because it's popular right now, and it may not be popular 10 years from now. It's really popular and cool to say, I'm a Stoic. It's cool. Ryan Holiday made it cool to be a Stoic. Well, what happens when it's not cool? Will people identify as Stoics when, just because they believe in virtue ethics? I don't know. Time will tell. It'll be
Thanks, Chris.
The Stoics future. Are not Stoic. The Christians are not Christian.
So
just because you believe something doesn't mean you're actually living it.
Yeah, sorry, Jacob. I wanted to wind down now, and I thank everybody for participating. We went like 30 minutes over, and now I have a dinner that because I only scheduled this for an hour. I had a dinner scheduled at 8 o'clock that I really need to make, and I'm getting messages that may imply that I need to start speeding things up. So just because we're recording, I didn't want it to just cut us off or just go abruptly, but I wanted to speak a little bit about traditional Stoicism in the beginning, what Chris does, and then modern Stoicism in the end, and then what that means for us practicing Stoics today, and how do we practice Stoicism with or without Stoic physics, virtue ethics, and so forth. This was a really good discussion, and Chris, thank you very much for taking your time and being here, because I know you're probably really busy, and it's really fortunate to have you on. Paul,
I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to engage in this kind of conversation, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding between traditional and modern Stoics, and I think a lot of it would be bridged by just having open discussions like this. We're not enemies. You know, we value a lot of the same things, and there's no reason to be antagonistic toward one another. As I try to tell the traditional Stoics, yeah, we need to differentiate because there is a difference. But that doesn't mean that modern Stoicism is wrong. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that it's different. And that's all there is. And it may be, in fact, as I've argued in my podcast, it may prove to be even in the long term more helpful to people and more viable than traditional Stoicism ever was. We will see.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Paul, Alvaro, and Jacob for coming on board. I'm sorry if I couldn't get to your questions. I know Alvaro probably had other questions in response, and Jacob, but I really needed to just taper this off now, so that we don't go too long, especially if somebody had prior appointments they had to make afterwards. So. For those of you interested, this coming Thursday, we have our usual discussion at 6:30. So please watch out. I have to make the event, but it will continue as a second part to our two-parter on Stoic character and knowledge, which we began on Thursday this past week. So if you're interested, you can come on board 6:30 this coming week on Thursday. And that's all I have for you guys. Thank you, everybody, for joining again. I do have to go, but I hope everybody has a good evening. Have a good Sunday, and I hope to see everybody once again. So take care, everybody.
Wish you all well. Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.